Vivid verses.
I build things for a living. Not in the romantic, sawdust on your hands way people sometimes imagine when I tell them I'm an architect. It's more precise than that, more mathematical. My name is Callum Reed, and I've been designing buildings in Hartwell for 11 years. Hartwell is the kind of mid-sized city that doesn't make anyone's top 10 list but quietly earns its place in the world. A river running through the old quarter, a decent arts district that emerged organically rather than by municipal decree, a university that exports more talent than it retains. The firm I co-founded, Reed and Parish Architecture, occupies a converted textile warehouse on Brennan Street in the Southgate neighborhood. We gutted the interior ourselves, my partner Owen Parrish and I, and rebuilt it with exposed brick, steel mezzanines, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flood the drafting tables with northern light. It was the most honest project we ever took on because it had no client to please but ourselves. I'm 38. I run 4 mornings a week along the river path that skirts the edge of Collier Park, usually before 6, when the city is still deciding whether to wake up. I cook reasonably well, read broadly, and maintain a small circle of people I trust completely. I'm not a complicated man, though I've sometimes been told I'm a difficult one, which is a thing people say when they mean you don't bend easily. I don't consider that a flaw. I met Vivian Ashford at a dinner party hosted by Owen and his wife, Cora, about 14 months ago. Owen collects interesting people the way some men collect watches, deliberately, appreciatively, with an eye for craftsmanship. Vivian was a textile designer who worked with a boutique fabric house called Loren and Voss on the west side, and she arrived that evening in a dark green dress with a confidence that wasn't performed. She had genuine opinions about things. She laughed at precise moments. She pushed back on something I said about brutalist architecture within about 4 minutes of meeting me, and she was partially right, which I told her. We were the last 2 people at Owen's dining table that night. Everyone else had drifted to the living room or gone home, and we were still talking about the relationship between materials and honesty in design, which sounds insufferably niche but felt, in that moment, like the most natural conversation in the world. I asked her to dinner the following Thursday. She said yes without hedging. The first 6 months were genuinely good. Vivian was quick and creative and brought a kind of warmth in the spaces she occupied. She had a wide network of friends and an ease in social situations that I admired because it doesn't come as naturally to me. We traveled to the coast in March, spent a long weekend in a rented house on the cliffs above Tamberton Bay, and I remember standing on the terrace the first morning watching the water while she made coffee inside, and thinking with some clarity that this was a person I could build something with. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what came later wasn't something I was looking for or predisposed toward or naive enough to have missed entirely. It emerged gradually, the way structural problems often do, not all at once, but as a slow accumulation of small failures in the material. The first thing I noticed was the accounting. Not financial accounting, emotional accounting. Vivian had a subtle but consistent tendency to revise history in her favor. Small things at first. A disagreement we'd had about plans for the weekend would be recalled differently by Monday. Her version featuring a more accommodating version of herself and a more unreasonable version of me. When I pointed this out, gently, the initial response was confusion, then hurt, then a kind of quiet certainty that I was the one misremembering. I'm not someone who second-guesses his own memory without cause. I paid attention. I started to notice the pattern more clearly. There was the evening in September when we'd agreed, explicitly, and I remember it precisely because I'd moved a site visit to accommodate it, to have dinner with some colleagues of mine at a restaurant called Allgate and Stone in the Funes district. Vivian arrived 40 minutes late, visibly irritated about something unrelated to us. When I asked quietly, between courses, if everything was all right, She told me later, on the drive home, that I had ambushed her in front of my colleagues by asking her that question, that it had been embarrassing, that I had a habit of putting her on the spot. I thought about that for 2 days, not in an anxious, circular way, more the way I'd examine a drawing that didn't look right, methodically checking each line. I went back over the evening. One quiet question between courses. No public confrontation. No raised voice. Nothing that any reasonable reading of events could classify as an ambush. I told her that, calmly, specifically. She cried. Then she told me that the fact I couldn't see how my behavior affected her was itself the problem. I'm not immune to the possibility that I'm wrong. I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again. But there's a difference between acknowledging a genuine mistake and accepting a false version of events to preserve someone else's comfort. I wasn't willing to do the second thing while pretending it was the first. Over the months that followed, the pattern became unmistakable. Vivian was not malicious in any cartoonish way. I want to be fair about that. I don't think she sat in a room devising strategies. I think she had never developed the tools to sit with accountability, and so her mind simply moved automatically, fluently, toward a version of events that required no accountability of her. The result, for me, was a quiet but persistent erosion. Not of my confidence, exactly, but of the ease I'd once felt in her company. I was always on some low-level braced. When I tried to raise concerns directly, the conversation would pivot. Her feelings about the concern would become the conversation. How it made her feel to be questioned. How exhausting it was to feel like she was always being scrutinized. How she needed a partner who trusted her. She wasn't entirely wrong about what she needed. She needed someone who would accept her framing without inspection. I'm not able to be that person. I'm not built for it. By November, I had made my decision with the same clarity I bring to any structural assessment. The load-bearing elements were compromised. The relationship wasn't going to hold. I spent 3 weeks being certain about this before I acted on it. I wanted to be sure I wasn't operating from emotion or fatigue or a bad week. I sat with it. The certainty didn't move. I called Vivian on a Wednesday evening and asked if she could come by my apartment the following evening, Thursday. I told her I needed to talk with her about something important. I didn't tell her what, because that kind of conversation deserves to happen in person, and because giving her an advance preview would have meant a different conversation entirely, managed, defended against, shaped before it could be had. She arrived at 7:30. I tidied the apartment, made tea, thought about what I wanted to say. My apartment occupies the top floor of a converted Edwardian building on Larkspur Avenue. High ceilings, original plaster cornicing, a view over the rooftops toward the river. I lived there for 6 years, and it was the closest thing to a built expression of my interior life that I'd managed. Vivian sat on the sofa and looked at me across the coffee table with an expression that was already guarded, already calculating. She knew this wasn't nothing. I sat in the chair across from her, elbows on my knees, and I told her clearly. I told her that I cared about her. That was true, and I wasn't going to strip it from the conversation for convenience. I told her that over the course of our relationship, I had noticed a persistent pattern in which my concerns were redirected. My memory of events was challenged without basis, and any attempt I made to raise issues was converted into a referendum on my own character. I told her this had happened consistently enough that I had spent considerable time examining whether it was something I was doing or perceiving incorrectly. I told her I was confident it was neither. I told her that this wasn't working and that I wasn't going to continue it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me I was being unfair. Then she told me I had always been emotionally withholding. Then she told me that I had never really been present in the relationship, that she had felt alone for months, that this felt like it was coming out of nowhere. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I noticed with the detached part of my brain that seems to run commentary regardless of the circumstances, that her response was itself a fairly precise example of what I just described. The immediate pivot to my failings, the reframing of a structural problem as a character defect in me. I didn't point that out. There was nothing useful in it at that point. When she'd finished, I said, "I hear what you're saying. I don't agree with the characterization, but I understand that's how you've experienced things." That difference in perception is part of why I think we're not right for each other. She tried several more angles. I didn't harden against them. I just stayed where I was. Grounded. Clear. Not angry, not cold, but not movable either. She left around 9:30. She didn't slam the door. I sat in the chair for a while after, watching the city lights through the window, and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. Mostly I felt clear. That has always been the state I work hardest to return to. I expected her to call. She did, several times over the next 2 days, which I let go to voicemail. Her messages ranged from hurt to cold to something approaching conciliatory. I didn't respond. There was nothing I had to say that hadn't been said, and responding would have opened a negotiation I had no intention of entering. What I didn't expect was the family. The first call came on Sunday morning at 10:15. I was at the kitchen counter with coffee in the property section of the Hartwell Gazette, a habit I've maintained for years, less for the listings than for the planning decisions buried in the back pages. The number was unfamiliar, and I answered it with the mild alertness I give to unknown callers. "Is this Callum?" A woman's voice. Warm, practiced, the kind of warmth that carries authority underneath it. "It is. Who's calling?" "This is Patricia Ashford, Vivian's mother." I registered this with a kind of interior stillness, the same feeling I get when I'm reviewing a structure and I find something unexpected in the foundation. Not panic, just heightened attention. "Mrs. Ashford," I said. "Callum, I hope you don't mind me calling. Vivian is. She's very upset. We're very concerned about her." A pause, calibrated. She told us what happened, and I want to speak with you directly. Viv has always been sensitive, you know. She feels things very deeply. I'm sure whatever happened between you, you didn't mean to hurt her. I noticed the structure of this. She'd led with concern, moved to characterization. Sensitive, feels things deeply, and then offer me an exit ramp via attributed innocence. It was a very fluid piece of rhetorical architecture. I wondered if she knew she was doing it. "I appreciate you reaching out," I said. "I can see you're worried about your daughter, and I understand that. Our relationship has ended, and that decision was considered and final. I hope Vivian is talking to people she trusts. But, Callum, she's not doing well. She hasn't eaten properly. She hasn't slept. I'm sorry to hear she's struggling," I said. "Those are hard feelings to sit with. I'd genuinely encourage her to speak with a professional who can support her through this properly." There was a pause. Patricia Ashford was recalibrating. "A professional," she repeated, in the tone of someone who has just been offered a foreign food at a dinner party. "Yes, a therapist, someone qualified to help her work through difficult emotions. That's not something I'm able to be for her." We exchanged a few more sentences, courteous, careful, going nowhere useful. I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation. I put the phone down and returned to my coffee. It had gone slightly cool, but it was still good. I sat with what I'd just learned. Vivian had gone to her family, which meant she was had framed this, in terms that had alarmed them enough to prompt a call. That told me two things. One, that her distress was real enough to mobilize people. Two, that the way she'd presented events had been sufficiently one-sided to make an intervention feel warranted. I was not surprised. It was, if I was being precise about it, consistent with the pattern. Monday brought a call from a man who introduced himself as Jeffrey Ashford, Vivian's father. He had a different energy than his wife, more directness, less warmth, the manner of a man who had spent decades in some kind of management. "Callum," he said, as though we were colleagues who'd skipped a meeting. "Jeffrey Ashford, I understand you've ended things with my daughter." "That's correct," I said. "She's at home with us right now. She's not in a good state." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had lowered slightly. "Look, man to man, Vivian is fragile. She always has been. The women in our family run warm, if you follow me. She takes things hard. I'm not saying what you did was wrong, necessarily, but the timing, the manner of it, it's hit her badly. We're worried about what she might do." There it is. Not a threat, not explicit enough for that. But the implication was a clear architectural feature of his approach. We're worried about what she might do. The weight of her potential actions placed on my shoulders. I let a brief silence sit before I responded. "Jeffrey, I can hear that you're worried, and I take that seriously. But I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not able to factor the possibility of someone's reaction into a decision about whether to remain in a relationship. That's not a standard I can accept, and I don't think it would serve Vivian well in the long run either. She needs genuine support, professional support, not a relationship she's staying in because people around her are afraid of what she'll do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You make it sound very simple." "It's not simple," I said, "but it is clear." He tried a few more angles. Her history, her difficulty with abandonment, a vague reference to a hard period she'd had some years ago. I listened to each one. I acknowledged each one without absorbing it as a mandate. We ended the call in a standoff that was polite enough on the surface. I stood in my office for a moment after, thinking about what Jeffrey Ashford had just, perhaps without fully realizing it, confirmed. Fragile. Always has been. We're worried about what she might do. This was not the language of a family encountering a crisis for the first time. This was the language of people with established protocols. People who had managed Vivian's emotional states for years with a particular set of tools. Contain, accommodate, make the external problem go away. I was being cast as the external problem. The understanding settled into place with the clean click of something that had been misaligned finally finding its groove. The gaslighting, the absence of accountability, the automatic reach for a revised version of events. These things don't emerge from nowhere. They develop in environments where they work, where someone with a gift for emotional escalation discovers, early and repeatedly, that escalation produces results, that accountability can be avoided, that others will manage consequences on your behalf. Vivian hadn't invented herself in isolation. She had been, in part, constructed by people who loved her enough to exempt her from the ordinary demands of reality. I didn't blame them for it. I also wasn't going to be recruited into it. By Tuesday evening, the calls had extended laterally through the family. A younger sister named Rosalind called around 7, and her approach was entirely different, less formal, more emotional, the cadence of someone who had been coached but was nervous. She told me she'd always liked me, that she thought we were good together, that Vivian talked about me in a way that showed how much she cared. I appreciated the effort. I told her honestly that I was glad to have gotten to know the family, and that I hoped Vivian would get the support she needed. Rosalind started crying gently before we finished, which I found genuinely affecting. She wasn't performing it. She was just worried about her sister and trying the only angle she could think of. After I put the phone down, I sat for a moment with something that might have been described as compassion for Rosalind, for what it was like to love someone like Vivian, to carry the weight of managing her turbulence, to be drafted into crisis management whenever something went wrong. That wasn't a small thing to live with. I recognized with some clarity that the people calling me were also, in their way, victims of the dynamic they'd spent years reinforcing. Wednesday brought a call from a man named Philip, identified as Vivian's older brother, who took a more assertive line. He suggested, without quite accusing that I had handled things poorly, that a man worth his word would have tried harder to work through difficulties. That ending a relationship without warning was a form of cruelty. I asked him politely when he believed I had done so without warning. He didn't have a specific answer to that. I told him that I had raised concerns in the relationship multiple times, and those concerns had not been engaged with productively. I told him that I'd spent time, weeks, being certain of my decision before acting on it. I told him that I wasn't going to defend the decision further, but that I was comfortable with it. He pushed once more, something about giving her another chance, about everyone deserving the benefit of the doubt. "Philip," I said, "I've already extended that benefit more than once. At some point, a pattern is a pattern." He didn't have a response to that either. The conversation ended shortly after. Thursday was quiet, and I began, cautiously, to assume that the campaign had reached its natural limit. I was wrong about that by approximately 18 hours. Friday evening, I was home by 7. Owen and I had been in a long review session over the structural drawings for a new project, a community library in the Castleford district, our biggest public commission in 3 years, and I was carrying the mild, satisfying fatigue of concentrated work. I'd changed out of my work clothes, opened a window to let the evening air in, and was assembling a simple dinner when I heard the buzzer from the street door. I went to the intercom panel by the front door and pressed the button. Yes, a voice I recognized as Patricia Ashford's, slightly distorted by the speaker. "Callum, it's Patricia. And Jeffrey. We'd like to speak with you, please. In person." I stayed with this for a moment, my hand resting on the intercom panel. I could have not let them in. That was a straightforward option, but it was also the kind of option that delays rather than concludes, and I was not interested in an extended siege. Better to have the conversation, conducted on my terms, and end it completely. "I'll buzz you in," I said. 3rd floor. I met them at the top of the stairs. Patricia was dressed with the careful neatness of someone who had prepared for this visit. Jeffrey was in a coat and tie, which struck me as a specific choice, a visual argument for seriousness. They both looked tired in the way people look when they've been carrying something for several days. "Come in," I said, and led them to the sitting room. I didn't offer to take their coats. It wasn't hostility, it was clarity. They were not here to stay. They sat together on the sofa. I took the chair across from them, the same chair I'd sat in when I spoke with Vivian. I found this mildly ironic and let it go. "We appreciate you seeing us," Patricia said. Her voice had the warmth of the phone call, but beneath it, now that she was in a room with me, I could see the strain. Her hands were folded in her lap with careful precision. "We know this is unusual." "It is," I agreed, without adding anything to that. Jeffrey leaned forward slightly. "Callum, we'll come to the point. Vivian is not doing well. She's been staying with us since Monday. She's barely left her room. We're genuinely frightened for her." He paused. "We think if you would just agree to see her, talk with her, give it some more time." "We've never interfered in her relationships before," Patricia added quickly. "We wouldn't be here if we weren't truly worried. What she might do." She stopped and pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. I looked at them both carefully. Two people who loved their daughter, who had organized their entire visit around a plea they believed was reasonable, who had, I suspected, talked themselves into this journey over multiple conversations, each one reinforcing the urgency until arriving on my doorstep felt not just justifiable, but necessary. I thought about the architecture of what they'd built around Vivian over the years. All the times the family had been mobilized. All the times an external problem had been solved or pressured away, rather than asking Vivian to develop the capacity to manage difficulty internally. Each intervention, individually, had looked like love. In aggregate, it had built something that couldn't stand on its own. I took a breath, and when I spoke, My voice was as even as I could make it. I want to say something to you both, and I want to say it with genuine respect. I can see that you love Vivian, and I can see that her distress is real, and I can see that being here tonight cost you something. I don't dismiss any of that. I paused, but I have to be honest with you. Jeffrey nodded, almost imperceptibly. He was the kind of man who responded to directness. I ended this relationship because there was a consistent pattern of behavior that I raised concerns about multiple times, and those concerns were not engaged with. My experience and my perceptions were regularly recharacterized in ways that placed responsibility for problems at my feet rather than examining them honestly. That is not a sustainable foundation. And my decision to leave is final. I've been clear about this since Thursday. Patricia opened her mouth. I continued, not sharply, just steadily. You've told me that Vivian is fragile, that she always has been, that you're worried about what she might do. I looked at them both carefully. I understand your concern for her well-being, but I am not responsible for managing an adult's emotional stability. She needs professional help, a proper therapist, someone qualified to work with her consistently over time. Not a relationship she's stayed in because her family is afraid of what she'll do if she's asked to stand on her own. The room was quiet. Patricia's composure wavered. Not dramatically, just a slight trembling at the edge of it. The way a structure shows stress before the visible crack appears. Jeffrey exhaled slowly. He was, I thought, a man who recognized a decision that had been reached and would not be revisited. He didn't enjoy it. His jaw was set and his posture was contained, but something in his expression shifted from argument to acknowledgement. You're saying we've enabled her, he said. I hadn't used that word. I appreciated that he had. I'm saying, I replied carefully, that the most loving thing anyone can do for Vivian right now is not to remove consequences from her path. It's to help her find someone with the tools to help her build better ones for herself. Patricia looked at her hands. When she looked up, there were tears, but they were quiet ones. Not a performance, not a weapon. Just sorrow being expressed by a mother who was tired and worried and starting, perhaps, to hear something she hadn't let herself fully hear before. She won't agree to therapy, she said softly. That may be true, I said. I can't change that, but I also can't be a substitute for it. Another silence. Then Jeffrey stood, and Patricia followed. I don't suppose there's anything we can say, he said. It wasn't quite a question. No, I said, simply, but I do hope she's all right. I mean that. He nodded. Patricia looked at me for a moment with an expression I found difficult to read. Not anger, not exactly. More like someone looking at a door they've realized has been standing open all along and deciding whether to walk through it. I walked them to the front door. Jeffrey went first, out onto the landing. Patricia paused in the doorway and turned back. She said you were cold, she said. There was no particular malice in it. She seemed to be filing a report. I know, I said. I met her eyes for a moment. Then I said, I hope you all get some rest. I closed the door. Gently. The latch caught with a quiet, definitive sound. I stood in the hallway of my apartment for a moment, then walked to the kitchen and returned to the dinner I'd been making. The onions I'd started before the buzzer had gone slightly past where I wanted them, but they were recoverable. I adjusted the heat, added a splash of stock, let them come back. There's usually a way to correct things if you catch them in time and don't overcorrect. I ate at the counter, standing, which I sometimes do when I want to think without the formality of the table. I thought about Jeffrey saying you're saying we've enabled her. The speed of it, not defensive, not erupting, just the recognition of a man who had perhaps known this on some level for a long time and had found, in the unlikely setting of his daughter's ex-boyfriend's sitting room, the circumstance that finally said it plainly. I didn't feel vindicated by any of this. Vindication requires an audience, and I've never been particularly interested in audiences. What I felt was something more practical. The clarity I'd been working toward since November, the decision, the conversation with Vivian, the days of calls, the visit tonight, all of it had moved through its necessary stages, and I was now, as far as I could determine, at the other side of it. There was no more pressure coming. The family had deployed everything they had. I had received it all, engaged with it on honest terms, and remained where I'd started. The following Tuesday, I sent Vivian a brief, final message. I want to include it here because I wrote it carefully and I think it represents something true. Vivian, I don't intend to have any further contact after this. I want to say clearly, I hope you're okay, and I hope you find the support you need. The difficulties in our relationship were real, and I think resolving them is possible, but not within the relationship and not with me. Take care of yourself. She didn't respond. I didn't expect her to. 2 weeks later, Owen and I were in the final design review for the Castleford Library. It was a long morning. The structural engineer had flagged a concern about the cantilevered reading room on the easter elevation, and we spent 3 hours going back and forth over the load distribution before we found a solution that maintained the aesthetic intent without compromising the integrity of the support. It required adjusting the primary beam configuration in a way that wasn't immediately obvious from the drawings, but was, once you saw it, clearly right. These are the problems I like best. The ones that look impossible until you find the angle from which the answer is visible. Owen and I were on our second coffee afterward, the drawings spread across the table between us, when he looked up at me over the rim of his mug. "You doing all right?" he said. Owen asks this about every 3 weeks on average because he's a person who keeps track. "Yes," I said. "Vivian, done." He nodded. He didn't push, which is one of the many reasons I've worked with him for 11 years. "The library's going to be good," he said. "It is," I agreed. We returned to the drawings. Outside the windows of the studio on Brennan Street, the afternoon light was moving across the old brick of the building opposite in the way it does in October. Low, in particular, finding angles that summer light misses. I noticed it the way I always notice light, as information, as material, as something that reveals the true dimensions of things. The beam configuration was right. The reading room would hold. I picked up my pencil and went back to work.
Thanks for listening.